Whenever somebody watches this movie, they all come away with the exact same question. How's that damn 3 seashell thing work? I have my own theory, and I'll tell you what it is in a few minutes. But first, roll the titles! Greetings and salutations to another Rewind review. In this video we are taking a look at a proper classic action movie, and that movie, finally, is Demolition Man. Released in 1993, Demolition Man sees a police officer brought out of suspended animation in prison to pursue an old ultra-violent nemesis who is loose in a non-violent future society. Directed by Marco Brambria and written by Peter M. Lenkov, Robert Renu and Daniel Waters, the movie stars Sylvester Stallone, Wesley Snipes, Sandra Bullock, Nigel Hawthorne, Benjamin Bratt, Bob Gunton, Glenn Shaddy, Dennis Leary, Bill Cobbs, Grandel Bush and Rob Schneider. Demolition Man. I have been itching to talk about this movie throughout almost the entirety of 2023, and I was beginning to think that I wasn't going to get the chance to do so. Alright, I'll admit, I didn't get the chance to do this movie last year. Time can be a bitch. You are fined 1 credit for a violation of the verbal morality statute. Oh, piss off! You are fined 1 credit for a repeated violation of the verbal morality statute. YouTube has been notified. So as you've probably guessed, I do actually quite like this one. It's a movie that I can watch and always have a good time with. I have seen Demolition Man quite a few times over the years, and it's one of those films that whenever I'm flicking through channels on TV and it just pops up for a few seconds, I tend to leave it on. The first time I ever saw this movie, I was with my dad, and he gave me the option of watching one of 2 movies. It was either going to be this movie or a little known movie that some of you might know called 12 Monkeys. And as you've probably guessed, this was the movie that I chose. I did eventually watch 12 Monkeys a few months later, and all I'll say is expectations were very much subverted. But as for Demolition Man, it really surprised me just how much I actually did enjoy this movie and the overall premise. Demolition Man, which starts off in 1996, is about a character called John Spartan, who gets nicknamed the Demolition Man due to his knack for causing large amounts of collateral damage when apprehending suspects. But when one particular hostage situation goes wrong, Spartan is sentenced to be cryogenically frozen alongside his psychopathic arch-nemesis Simon Phoenix. Years later, in 2032, now a world where society has changed and all violent crime has been eliminated, Phoenix manages to escape, and with the authorities of the future ill-equipped to handle someone as dangerous as him, Spartan is released to help capture and stop Phoenix once again. So needless to say, based on who is starring in this movie as well as the opening action sequence, I thought that this movie was just going to be a straight up action movie. I wasn't expecting it to turn into a full-on sci-fi movie. I mean, well, yeah, it is still a full-on action movie. I'm not saying that there isn't any action in this movie and it isn't really sort of classified as an action movie, but there is a lot more to it. It plays out like a police detective style movie with a little bit of a mystery element thrown in too. I mean, it's not a great one, but it's mixed in with a fish out of water element, with Spartan being in a completely different time setting and everyone's way of life is completely different to what he already knows. And the future world that they feature in this movie is one of the most memorable aspects of this film, and it does have some really good creative ideas that really do help make this movie feel fun. I think my biggest gripe with the overall story is that it does feel like there's 2 separate stories going on at the exact same time. The main plot is focused on Spartan's hunt for Phoenix, but the other plot focuses on a culture clash between the people who choose to live by their own rules and those who have embraced this new heavily sanitized way of living. Both of these stories do overlap and they do kind of feed into each other, and while they are interesting, I can't help but feel as though the Spartan and Phoenix story would be more than enough. Or you could trim down on a few unnecessary elements of this movie so you have a little bit more time freed up to explore the rivalry between Spartan and Phoenix. But it does add a lot more to this movie, and I do appreciate that they are trying to do a lot more with this movie and with this premise so it doesn't just become another generic action movie. And speaking of being trimmed, it does feel like there are a few things that are missing in this movie. It does feel like there are a few scenes, a few sequences that have either been trimmed out or just never filmed in the first place, because there are times where things do happen but then it kind of jumps forwards in time to a completely different scene altogether, and it feels like there's something missing in that space. I don't feel like it's distracting and it doesn't derail the story or anything like that, and I'll be completely honest, it does help this movie kind of flow a little bit faster. This is quite a fast-paced movie and it does manage to do quite a lot within its runtime. There are conveniences absolutely throughout this movie that help speed the story along, and there are times where things happen just for the sole purpose of keeping the story going. Like there are times where Spartan sees Phoenix in the distance and he shouts at him, "Phoenix!" and that gives Phoenix time to move out of the way before Spartan decides to start shooting. I know it's nitpicky, but it is fun nonetheless. This is one of those movies that you just have to go into with the sole purpose of just having fun. But for an action movie, I've got to admit that a lot of the ideas and concepts that they do introduce throughout this movie can actually be really good. They can be really interesting and quite funny as well. Bear in mind, this movie came out in 1993 and is predicting stuff in a very tongue-in-cheek way. Things that will happen in about 8 years from now. And it's a bit freaky seeing how much it actually does get right and how close other things were. Obviously, one popular theory that a lot of sci-fi movies and TV shows had was that we were going to be using screens to communicate with each other across the world, which has happened. Self-driving cars are slowly starting to get introduced in the real world. They are featured quite heavily in this movie, but the self-inflating tyres, I don't know how far off we actually are from having stuff like that. Physical contact between people in the world of Demolition Man is banned, which pretty much happened during the pandemic, and I think that after the pandemic happened, it has definitely been a lot more under the microscope than it was before. There's a load of other subtle things that are sprinkled throughout this movie as well, like the fact that there's a member of the public who phones into the police station and the operator who answers asks them if they would prefer an automated voice. It's also one of those movies that features those little tiny discs that for some reason people were convinced were going to replace CDs and DVDs. I really don't know why that was a thing. All of the people in this movie have little chips in the back of their hands which help identify them, track them, and deal with all their monetary transactions. And I feel like phones and like watches, like the more high-tech ones where you can like click your fingers together and like turn alarms off and everything, that's pretty close to that. Plus, they mentioned that basically anything that's bad for you is illegal, like cigarettes, like meat, like chocolate, like spicy food. Even the music featured throughout this movie is very different to what it is that you would expect from a futuristic sci-fi film, with songs basically being non-existent, and the only thing that people listen to are the jingles from different commercials. I'll talk about the product placement a little bit later on. I do quite like the little joke about Arnold Schwarzenegger being a former president in this world, and this is years before The Simpsons even did that joke. You know, obviously Arnold Schwarzenegger didn't become president, but he did become the governor of California for a little bit, and given how events in the US have kind of unfolded over the past few years, I do think that it was a possibility. But by far my favourite thing in this movie, outside of Wesley Snipes, is the running joke about not being able to swear. No matter how many times I watch this movie, those scenes will never not be funny. There's like all these little ticketing machines that are dotted all around the city and all these environments that all the characters are in, and anytime somebody swears, a little ticket pops out and there's like a little warning that goes off alongside it. And if they keep on doing it, the authorities get alerted. It is genuinely one of the funniest parts of this movie, especially when you can hear one being set off in the background during some of the more dramatic scenes, or even when Spartan doesn't have any toilet paper to hand, so he goes over to one of the machines and he just starts swearing into it, and he's just collecting in all the little slips to use. This is probably the best time to bring up the 3 seashells, because I've got a feeling that anyone who hasn't seen this movie before, that comment about the toilet paper might be a bit weird. Basically, instead of toilet paper, they use these things called the 3 seashells, and Spartan, who's from the 90s, has absolutely no idea what they are, and nobody offers any sort of explanation to how it is that they actually work. Naturally, the internet is taken over and there's lots of people out there trying to work out what it is that they actually do and how they're used, and there's all sorts of different theories out there. So I thought I'd throw my 2 cents in and tell you what I think. Quite simply, I think that they are buttons. First one flush, second one wash, third one dry. But based on what it is that both Sylvester Stallone and Sandra Bullock have said in the past, I don't actually think that that theory is true. Basically what they've said, without getting too graphic, is that using them involves a lot of scraping and using them like chopsticks, because that's so much cleaner than paper. Anywho, those are the main theories. It's just another funny thing that is added into this movie, and it does lead to some pretty entertaining scenes. Honestly, the comedy throughout this is really funny. It's definitely cheesy and quite tongue-in-cheek at times, as I said, but it does fit the tone of this movie. It doesn't take away from the action, and it does get a few chuckles. Especially the fact that Spartan is now a seamstress in the future, and some of his references to it are delivered really well by Stallone. Hence the sewing kit in the thumbnail. Honestly, Sylvester Stallone, this is the perfect kind of movie for him, and he is genuinely great as John Spartan. His performance is pretty much what you'd expect, with a mix of cheesy one-liners, taking part in some pretty demanding action scenes, and running away from lots of explosions. But he does get to show show off his more dramatic side in a couple of scenes where he finds out what happened to his family while he was frozen, and when he gets to confront some of the bigwigs and some of his colleagues. I do wish that we did get a little bit more drama from John Spartan, because I do feel like there is a lot of things that they could do. In one scene, they do make a point of bringing up the fact that Spartan does actually have a daughter out there somewhere in the world, but that doesn't really factor into the plot. It would have added a bit more emotional weight to this movie if Spartan's daughter actually did make an appearance, but I do think that it is a missed opportunity that they could have had his daughter maybe making an appearance in this movie either towards the end of the film or towards the middle section as kind of like a way of them sort of like easing Spartan into the 2030s, and maybe she does kind of factor into the finale in some way, and maybe that raises the tension and emotional stakes because Phoenix knows who she is and Spartan has to basically try and protect her. The finale as is, I do think is good, but I don't think that you really sort of feel like the tension of things are going to escalate quite severely if Spartan doesn't stop Phoenix once and for all. So I do think that that would have added more tension and more personal stakes for Spartan. But as I said, it is fine. I do think it is a missed opportunity to not include her in some way, but I do think that as it is good. You know, it did actually cross my mind at one point that maybe Huxley could have been his daughter at one point in time. I mean, it would need a severe rewrite, absolutely, especially in a couple of other scenes. But I do think that that could have been an interesting idea, maybe having Spartan teaming up with his daughter who has grown up in this heavily sanitised world and her trying to teach him about this way of life. But she sort of finds out the hard way about what it is that he's been through as a police officer from the 90s. Plus, it would help explain why it is that she's so obsessed with that era as well, with all the stuff that she collects in her office. But as I said, if they had decided to go in that direction instead, then it would absolutely need a severe rewrite. I also think that she'd need to be a bit older as well, because the age difference wouldn't really add up, because like Huxley would need to be like in her 40s at least by that point in time. I definitely think that they could have done a little bit more there. I do think that the daughter could have factored into the story a little bit more in some way, but the movie doesn't necessarily need it. But other than that, I do really like Stallone in this movie. This is absolutely one of my favourite movies that he has starred in, and I genuinely cannot picture anybody else playing this role. Plus, the Rambo reference wouldn't be anywhere near as funny. But as fun as Stallone is as John Spartan in this movie, by far, the best part of the entire film is Wesley Snipes as Simon Phoenix. Wesley Snipes is so much fun to watch in this, and in the words of the therapist, he brings joy feelings to all who watch Demolition Man. He's really over the top, slightly unhinged in a comic book villain kind of way, and he is genuinely really funny with some of the best lines of the entire film. I don't know how many of his lines are actually improv, but I do feel like there are a lot of moments where the dialogue does feel very spur of the moment, and it is genuinely really funny. His costume and overall look as well is a bit mad, with like all like the tyre sort of pattern and designs all over him, but it is recognisable and it is memorable. And considering how fast and active that he needs to be throughout this movie, it doesn't weigh him down, it doesn't get in the way, and it does allow him to still maintain that speed. Rewatching this movie, I did get the impression that potentially Phoenix might be inspired by characters like the Joker based purely on how he acts. I don't know if that is genuinely the case for 100% certainty, but there is a sequence where you go into Huxley's office, played by Sandra Bullock, and on her table, like, her room is filled with lots of figures, posters, DVD, all sorts from like the 80s sort of era. And one of the things that she does have is an action figure of both Batman and Joker from the 1989 movies. So it is possible. And that's not the only connection that Demolition Man actually has to a Batman movie, but I'll save that for a bit later. But when it comes to Wesley Snipes in this movie, it is so jarring seeing him like this in this movie, because I am so much more used to seeing Wesley Snipes in far more serious roles, especially things like Blade, for instance. I can't remember if I had actually seen any of the Blade movies before seeing this one, but it is such a different performance for both of these characters that is really great. He is absolutely amazing in this movie. He is perfectly cast, and I absolutely love the character. Plus, we also have Sandra Bullock in this movie playing a character called Huxley, and as always, she is great. Huxley is one of the police officers that Spartan has to work with in 2032, and she kind of takes on the role of guiding Spartan through this new world. There is this naivety to her, and she's obsessed with the 20th century and fills her office with posters, toys, as I said, and more from that era. And with all that comes this desire to see some action, which she does get, and it kind of brings it down to earth a bit, which I quite liked. I also really like that Sandra Bullock is able to make sure that this character stays believable and grounded, because it would be so easy for this character to feel like a straight up caricature, because all of the characters that are from the 2030 era all act a very specific way, and it would be very easy for all these characters to feel and come across as a bit cheesy. But the way that Sandra Bullock does it in this movie, it does work, and you do buy into it. Huxley is a decent character overall. She does get quite a bit to do throughout this movie. She does get a few action scenes as well as some funny moments, and the performance from Sandra Bullock is great. Everyone is doing some good work and delivering some pretty solid performances, like Dennis Leary, Nigel Hawthorne, Benjamin Bratt, Bob Gunton, Glenn Shaddy and Bill Cobbs. They all do have similar vibes with cheesy dialogue and things like that, same as Huxley, and the characters from the governed world seem to speak in an almost robotic way, which is contrasted quite well with how the underground talk. It's subtle and it gives you a really good idea about who these characters are. And the other subtle thing in this movie is a blink and you'll miss it cameo from the one and only Jack Black. I didn't even know he was in this until somebody pointed it out. The performances from everyone are really good in this movie, weird ADR aside, but it does look like everyone in this movie is having a load of fun. Now, let's talk about the product placement. I had completely forgotten just how prominent the product placement actually is in this movie. The commercial songs pop up everywhere, they're being sung in restaurants, they're appearing on the radio, as well as the fact that Taco Bell is like the only restaurant that anyone ever goes to. To be fair, they do actually give a funny reason why it is that Taco Bell is like the only restaurant in the 2030s. But weirdly, I've seen two different versions of this movie. I didn't even realise that this was even a thing, but the version that I've normally watched is the movie with Taco Bell. That is the one that most people will have seen. But this other version that I've also seen was all about Pizza Hut, and Pizza Hut is the thing instead of Taco Bell. And that's what set me on the dodgy ADR throughout this movie, because what it is that they do is every single time that they mention Taco Bell, it's being dubbed over as Pizza Hut, and you can tell that they are saying Taco Bell, they are mouthing Taco Bell, but it sounds completely different. They are not saying that at all. I genuinely don't understand it, but it is really funny. Anyway, I probably should mention the action in this movie, because that is a large part of this film. The fights, chases and set pieces in this are big, fun, fast and kind of brutal. It embraces those over-the-top elements that you'd expect from an older action movie, like running away from explosions, people jumping from cars and helicopters and stuff like that. It's kept as real and practical as it can be, with some decent editing and choreography, good use of the environments and some excellent stunt work. It definitely earns that 15 certificate or R rating in the US, but it's not too bad. The fights are a load of fun and take place in some pretty imaginative locations, like the prison Spartan and Phoenix were frozen in, as well as the Museum of Violence, which looks like a wasteland from an old-fashioned action film. The set design is genuinely impressive all round, to be honest. The costumes are interesting as well and have these unique designs that fit this world and both look believable and are still a bit futuristic. I do think that the technology that is featured throughout this movie, like especially when it comes to computers for instance, I do think that they could have done a little bit more to make them look a little bit more advanced, because they do still look like things that did come from the 80s and 90s. But this was a movie that was made in the early 90s, so it does make sense. They even make full use of using miniatures as well as some bits of camera trickery throughout this movie to make things look a little bit more real. And that also includes the sequence where Spartan is getting frozen, because what it is that the crew actually did is they made a full-scale, lifelike prop of Sylvester Stallone, which apparently someone actually found at an antique store a couple of years ago. I have so many questions about that, but I don't know where to start. Anyway, the effects in general throughout this movie are pretty good. They're used very sparingly and they're only used when absolutely necessary, and that's why whenever they are used, they do fit and they do work quite well. And as for the music by composer Elliot Goldenthal, it is mostly okay. It is pretty simple and at times it can feel a bit generic, but it is good overall. It does suit the movie and it does fit the style and tone of the film. I want to say that the soundtrack isn't really that memorable, but at the same time, I do remember little snippets of this soundtrack being used in other things, like, and I don't know why this specifically, but I do remember it being used in the trailer for Men in Black 2. I think the reason for that is because I used to have Spider-Man on DVD, and that was one of the trailers that would always play before the film. So maybe that's why. But I've got to admit, and I completely forgot about this, Sting made a song for this movie, and it's featured in the credits. And it's actually quite good and it's quite catchy. But when it comes to a lot of the other songs that are featured in this movie, pretty much all of them are just jingles from old commercials. It does make sense, as I said, they are woven into the story pretty well, and whenever it is that they do pop up, it does get a laugh out of you. I do think that the soundtrack is okay overall. It mixes together this sci-fi sound that's not unlike what it is that they did with the soundtrack for The Fifth Element, with like this military sort of snare beat. And as I said, it is pretty fitting. But I also thought that this soundtrack sounded a bit more almost like superhero-y at times, to the point where there were times where, especially during some of the action sequences, I was listening to it and I'm thinking, this sounds exactly like the soundtrack from Batman Forever and Batman and Robin. And I decided to look into this, and it turns out that yes, Elliot Goldenthal is the composer for Demolition Man and both Batman Forever and Batman and Robin as well. That's why they sound so similar. I don't mind that though. But yeah, for this movie, I do think that it does work overall, and it is okay. Usually you can tell whenever it is that a soundtrack has been composed by a specific composer, like Hans Zimmer, like Danny Elfman, like John Williams. But it is weird whenever you do hear something from them that is so different to what they normally do, when you see their name pop up in the credits and you're just like, oh, that was them. That's not the case here, but it is good and it does fit the movie. Overall, this movie is a load of fun. It's not perfect by any means. It does have some plot holes, some rushed elements. The music doesn't quite stand out, and the film maybe tries to do a bit too much. But the concepts and ideas, the basic story, the performances and characters, the action, effects, stunt work and set design are all really good, entertaining and imaginative. It is very over the top at times and a bit bonkers, but that all adds to the charm. I don't know if this will be for everyone. There are a couple of scenes that may be a little offensive to the more sensitive viewers, but in all honesty, if you have never seen this film before, give it a chance, and I am sure that you will have a good time with it. So with all that being said, my rating for Demolition Man is a 7 out of 10. Well, what else can I say except I like it. I like it a lot. It is a really fun movie, and I have always enjoyed it. My dad always used to tell me about the tie-in game that was released at around about the same time as the film. And apparently what it is that they did was they actually recorded a few scenes of Sylvester Stallone in character for some of the loading screens, as well as whenever it is that your character gets killed off. Apparently he pops up on the game over screen and he just goes, "You suck." I have looked into it quite recently, and I actually found a compilation video of all the little insults that he does throw at you whenever you do fail at the game, and they are actually quite funny. Check them out if you have the chance. I don't know how different the game actually is to the movie, because tie-in games rarely match up with the movie because they need to have a lot more to them, especially like when it comes to like the Spider-Man games, which I used to absolutely love. They are nothing like the movies whatsoever, apart from the voice actors. But when it comes to Demolition Man, it does make me curious about what other stories you could tell set within this world. I know that quite recently they have started talking about a potential sequel to Demolition Man, but I don't know how serious that is, and I don't know if it will happen. Plus, if they are unable to actually find a villain or an antagonist that can match the energy of Wesley Snipes in this movie, then I don't think it will be as good. But time will tell, and I could be completely wrong, so we'll see what happens. Anyway, that is pretty much everything I want to say for this video, so if you have watched this video, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoy this content, please like and subscribe, and be sure to hit the notification button to keep up to date on everything that is going on here. If you have seen Demolition Man, let me know down in the comments what you think about it. Plus, if you have any suggestions for any future Rewind reviews you would like to see me do, let me know down below. Thank you once again for watching, and I will see you next time on Rewind Reviews. See you guys.